Welcome to this workshop on living with deer as a foothill gardener, presented by the Nevada County Master Gardeners. Here is our workshop presenter, Bonnie Brott.
Well, good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name, as Margaret said, is Bonnie Brott. I've been with the Nevada County Master Gardeners Group for a little over 15 years, and I really look forward to being able to share our knowledge with you. And today, we'll try to give you some hints on living with deer as a foothill gardener. Everybody knows that part of the appeal of living in the foothills are the critters. Many of us moved here to make the local wildlife part of our lives, and we enjoy being able to look out and see them in our yard, interacting with each other, being able to enjoy how beautiful they are. But when it comes to the deer, many of us who have been here for a while have learned that we have a problem because those beautiful critters tend to enjoy all of the plants that we love to plant, especially in our veggie garden. And so it ends up a real love-hate relationship with the deer in the local county. And we will try to teach you today a little bit of how to get along better, how to handle your garden a little bit better, so there's a little more love and a little less hate in this two-way street.
And Bonnie, did you want to share your Bonnie, did you want to share your slide?
Yes. I thought I was. Okay, so hold on. And okay, there we go. Everybody see it now?
Perfect.
Okay. And of course, now my arrows aren't working. So we will just assume that they will start working soon. And there we go. Let's start at the beginning. So these are the critters that we're enjoying in the foothills, and we do realize that we have a problem with some of the deer that wander by. So we will learn to try to love a little more and hate a little less. And most of us know the signs that the deer have been visiting, and that is tracks, droppings, which is an interesting, if you haven't seen them before, and I'm betting most of us have, the droppings are tiny little balls, which you wouldn't expect necessarily from a large animal like a deer, but it's large piles of tiny little balls. So that is absolutely diagnostic. Now, as far as the trails go, this is one right here that's right behind my yard. And actually that's me right there taking this picture. And the deer walk the same trails, creatures of habit, absolutely, to the point where they wear the grass out or they wear out the snow. They wear out the snow where they're walking day by day, same trail. So you can usually see them in their yard, in your yard. The damage that they cause, that's another whole kettle of fish. And as far as the damage that you will see, it can go anywhere from the ultimate signs, the deer eating up as far as they can reach on all this lawn of trees, the deer eating everything they can reach in your vegetable garden and looking you in the face when you walk out there and find them, nipping all of the leaves off of your hosta so that all is left is the little stems. And speaking of stems or branches, they will nip the branches off your trees, shrubs. You can usually tell these teeth marks are almost visible, and this slanted pattern of eating is really obvious usually. And then, of course, they don't just have to eat in order to damage your plants. This guy is doing what all the male deer do when they grow their antlers in the springtime. They try to rub off that itchy, itchy velvet coating that coats the antlers until they get rid of it. Unfortunately, often it's getting rid of it on your trees. So we're going to go through the biology and the habits of the foothill deer just a little bit, because I want you to know a little bit about how to use those against them. So deer enjoy food variety. They are not a one crop pest. They will enjoy your trees and fruits, nuts, berries, shrubs, ground cover, just about anything that you plant, and except possibly the ones that they call deer resistant. And we will talk about those later extensively. But deer like to eat a lot of different things. Now, not just eating, but they will trample young plants. They'll damage your trees and shrubs by rubbing their antlers, as we showed in that previous picture, to remove the velvet. And they usually feed at dawn and dusk, although you certainly can see them in your yard at noon or midnight, but dawn and dusk and the nighttime is their favorite. And that is often when we are not out there to chase them away. So they will have sort of the run of your garden during that time. That makes them a problem. Now they can get used to or habituated to just about anything that doesn't kill them or hurt them. Remember that word habituated, because it's going to be a common usage word when you're talking about deer. And deer will not change their behavior. It is very deeply ingrained. So we must be the ones to change ours. Management possibilities. Well, there aren't a lot of them, but let's talk about the ones we do have. We have deterrence, those things which will try to drive the deer away. There are no permits needed. I can recommend them with caveats or warnings for what you need to watch out for. There are mechanical frightening devices, lights, blinking, flashing lights, strobe lights, various types of noisemakers, up to and including propane cannons. I'll tell you about those later. And then we have chemical repellents, which you can spray on, or dogs. Dogs are, of course, the best as far as the deterrents go, and we'll talk about that too. Just remember the word habituated. The deer can get used to just about anything, and pretty much all of these, except the dogs. Now, physical exclusion or fences or barriers are by far the best choice as far as keeping deer out of one particular area of your yard or garden. And we'll discuss extensively about fences and barriers, cages, etc., over individual plants or whole areas of your garden. Now, as far as the height of a fence, that's everybody's first question. How high do I need to make it? Well, for the most part, and this is a very general statement, deer will not jump a 6-foot fence unless they are motivated, either by being chased or by trying to get at something that's on the other side of that 6-foot fence. But it is fairly easy for them to jump a 6-foot fence once they learn that they can do it. So an 8-foot fence is much more common as far as the desirable height of fences to build around your fenced-in area, but there is one exception. If the deer are coming down the hill and your fence is here and your garden is here, remember that the deer won't have to jump all the way over whatever height of fence this is. They will have a running start coming down this hill. So in that case, these fences might have to be 10 or 12 feet high to prevent the deer from coming over them whenever that is when they're jumping down a hill. So keep that in mind if you have a hill in your yard's layout. Now, chemical repellents and frightening devices. There are a lot of types sold. If you go online and do a Google search for chemical deer repellents or deer frightening devices, you will get hundreds of websites. The effectiveness is questionable. And the basic answer is almost all of these things will work for a short while. The deer will then become used to them and they won't work anymore. So you end up having to either change, alter what you're using on a routine basis so the deer don't get used to it, or you need to try something else, like a fence. Most chemical repellents, keep in mind, are not allowed on food crops. Chemical repellents that they use are often pretty ghastly. They will use rotten eggs, garlic, fish, blood, predator urine, things that will definitely work, at least for a short while with the deer, but may smell absolutely awful to humans as well. So you're not going to want to put those things on the plants that are right next to your front door and that your guests would smell as they would be walking up to your house. And so you need to find something else. And some sprays will damage plants. So you need to maybe try one until you find what works for you. As what says here, some smell terrible to humans. Although there are some now being made that are very strong mint smell, which usually doesn't smell that terrible to humans. So you can try those and they will probably work just about as well. Keep in mind that most chemical repellents work because the deer rely completely on their sense of smell. Remember that they're usually out at night when vision is a less capable way of finding danger that's approaching. But when they have the sense of smell functioning, they can smell that mountain lion that's sneaking up behind them. And so if they come across a plant or a sprayed area that smells very strongly, they are going to avoid it because they need their sense of smell to be accurate to smell that sneaky mountain lion that is coming. Most repellents like these should be applied before the deer start eating them, because once the deer start eating them, they will become habituated toward liking that plant. And then even if you spray it, they will probably still keep eating it. And many of these sprays will wash off. And so with rain, with irrigation, so you need to reapply them. And remember that new growth will not have the spray on it. So you need to reapply as the plant grows. Now, as far as frightening devices, all the different ones that we've mentioned, there are ultrasonic frightening devices that you can just stick into the ground near the plants that are in question, that are being endangered. And these are often solar powered, so you really don't have a lot to do to install them. And I have often read on websites that they are guaranteed to rid your garden of the deer within 48 hours or your money back. Well, that's great, but the deer will probably be gone for at least 48 hours. Of course, after 48 hours, they're probably going to start getting used to it and then they'll come back. But by then, you can't get your money back. So do be a little careful whenever you're buying something that is probably only going to work for a short period of time. I keep mentioning that dogs are a really good opportunity, and dogs are one of the best of the frightening devices that you can use against a deer. Dogs are unpredictable. They don't always bark, but they do bark. They will chase deer, many of them will, and the deer never know which direction they're coming from or whether they're going to bark or not. And so they often don't become habituated to the dogs. But many of us don't allow our dogs to stay out all night. They come into the houses with us. And so bless their heart, even if they wanted to help us by chasing the deer away, they are going to be of limited use as long as they're not out there. And the deer, I mean, look at this. The deer can, they can wander around and graze next to a freeway or on the road with the cars, and even grazing next to an airport runway where planes are landing, taking off, next to a military reservation where ordnance is being shot off. The deer will just continue grazing. So in a way, our pitiful attempts to scare them away are probably going to be of minimal value. But then we have the deer fencing, which is great. This is an example of a deer fence that's going to do a good job of keeping the deer out. It's plenty tall enough. It's stretched between, in this case, wooden posts that are sunk into the ground and about 6 to 8 feet across, so that you can keep that mesh fencing tight, and you can keep an eye on it to make sure that this doesn't come loose or that the posts don't fall down. We just mentioned this, the mesh fencing can be stretched, and it can be different sizes of mesh. And in my backyard, when I first moved in, we had a fence present, and I'll show you that right now. This is my yard, and the mesh fence was only about 4 or 5 feet tall. So rather than replace everything, what I did was to replace the T-posts with taller ones, and I strung 9 or 10 gauge wire, smooth wire, not barbed wire. You definitely don't want to use barbed wire, and stretch it at about maybe 6 to 8 inch, or even 10-inch intervals above your mesh fencing to the height that you finally want it to be, about 8 feet. And the deer will perceive that fence as being solid. They have for 20 years from my backyard, and they will have not, I shouldn't say this because I'll jinx myself, but they have not yet tried to jump over this fence to get in my yard. They have very occasionally found their way into my yard because I would leave the gate open, which is something that you've got to watch out for. But once they're in my yard and I'm chasing them out, they will be motivated enough to try to jump through this fence. And they can do that, even though they don't like to do that, because this area isn't really wide enough for them to get through cleanly. So they will often catch a hoof, or the bucks will catch their antlers, and they will sort of rattle as they go through, and they don't like it. So they have not often done that, but it does happen. And this kind of fence can be a danger to deer if they do get caught on their way in or out, which they have never come in, but they have gone out. And I do feel badly because of that, but often because this kind of fence is a bit safer for them. Yes, it's more expensive. It's pricier. So you do want to be careful when you install this one in particular. Keep this distance as small as you can, because you don't really want to hurt them. You don't want them to get hung up. It's not great. This is a little layout of the way you can put together a mesh fence. These smaller holes on the bottom are meant to keep out things like rabbits, skunks, etc. And that's why they do make mesh fence like this, with smaller on the bottom and larger holes on the top. Now, deer can crawl under the fencing if the space is left there, or if the ground is uneven and there are holes under there. So you do want to be careful, fill in any depressions, any uneven areas on the ground under the fence with rocks or gravel or railroad ties or whatever, to discourage them from coming in that way. And keep your fences in good repair, because a hole like this or an area like this is an open invitation for them to walk in, just like leaving your gate open accidentally, which I have done several times. Now, this is just one example of why a deer fence is sort of important. I have one plant called a rock rose, cistus, which is one plant. And this is outside the deer fence, and this is inside. This is obviously not a deer-resistant plant. So the deer go through every single leaf, every flower on the part of that plant that's outside the fence, which I finally ended up removing. But the inside is perfectly safe and happy. So that's the way you can protect parts of your yard that need protection, and definitely protect your vegetable garden with a fence, because there are really no such thing as deer-resistant veggies. They love that same veggies that we plant. So it's going to be a trick to try to keep them out of a vegetable garden unless you have a fence. Now we'll go into individual plant protection, because you don't always want to fence in an entire area just to protect one or two particular individual plants. You can see that trees in particular might need to be protected, especially small ones, when they are first planted, because of exactly what that big guy is doing. So young trees can be individually fenced with this wraparound wire. You can buy this at any one of a number of websites or nurseries, or you can make it yourself with wire. And newly planted items, of course, as we mentioned, should be protected until the deer have become accustomed to their presence. I mean, deer are creatures of habit, and they're very curious. Anything that's new in their world, they are going to want to investigate. And they will try it, even if it tastes terrible or if it makes them sick, because they can't overcome that curiosity. So anything new should be protected, even if it's called deer resistant. Don't believe it, because the deer don't read those lists. Poultry wire, heavier woven wire, maybe 14 gauge, and you can get powder coated wire, which is going to last a long time, galvanized, of course, because you don't want it to rust, or even strong plastic netting are possibilities to make individual protection for plants. That orange plastic netting on the freeways is something that you can use. It's pretty ghastly looking whenever it's just spotted around your yard. You may want something a little bit less brilliant colored, but they do come in many colors. So look for whatever you think will work in your area. Now, this is a couple of examples of your individual plant protection. This is a cage. You can buy it commercially. You can make something similar if you want to use wire. You need to make sure it's anchored onto the ground, because the deer will push it over or butt it with their heads to try to get to that plant, especially if it's yummy and tasty enough. So just anchor it down. This next one is a person that's wrapping a lightweight netting around a small tree. The deer will then not munch these branches because they don't like that netting in their mouth. So they will leave it alone and tend not to strip the bark off of these trees. I don't know that it would protect a whole lot from the deer rubbing their antlers on it, but it is an easy and inexpensive way to protect a young tree. Now, this over here is another way. It's a little pricier and a little more work, but hey, it's a nice, good-sized metal cage that's stabilized by these T-posts, and that's a really good thing to do. Make sure they're anchored well into the ground and that the deer can't reach over the top or push in the sides to get at that little tree until it's big enough to take care of itself. Down here, we have a mesh cage, which is sold commercially, and it's 4 foot by 8 foot. And you can use it, as in this picture, to protect individual plants. And it's got a door that you can zip up and down and you can walk inside. Or you can use this to put over a raised bed to protect everything in it, as long as you make sure, again, to anchor the bottom onto the raised bed so that the deer can't move it. Here is somebody else's way of protecting the raised bed, which is individual cages over individual plants or rows of plants in a raised bed. And that will work. There's only one thing. That is that when these plants grow big enough and their leaves start to stick out beyond the cage, the deer will come by and nip every single leaf that's sticking out beyond the protection of the cage. So all that you will have protected is exactly what is inside the cage. And that same thing works, by the way, for plants in your yard. I have a burning bush, one of those very pretty plants for a pretty fall color, that is outside in my yard with a cage around it. And the deer take off every single leaf that dares to stick out beyond that cage. So either I will have to leave the cage forever, which doesn't look very good, or I will eventually have to move that plant because it is most definitely not deer resistant. So people ask, what about feeding them something else? Feeding them corn or something to entice them away from my landscape plants? Well, the answer is don't. Please don't, because that's not going to work in the long run. The deer will come, they will eat your corn, they will love your corn or your salt lick if that's what you're going to put out, but they will then come to think of your yard as being a source of great stuff to eat. And when they get tired of corn or eat it all up, they will move on to your landscape plants. So trying to bait them in or feed them something to distract them simply isn't going to work. So please don't. And you also will probably bait them into your neighbor's yard too, if they are close by. So probably not a good idea. And then comes this question, which I always get every time I give this talk. Why can't I shoot them? Or can I shoot them? The answer almost always is no, you can't. There are a lot of laws in the state of California about hunting and use of firearms, and you have to obey all of them. If you want to try to shoot a deer on your property, you still have to have a hunting license and a deer tag and the correct kind of firearm and the correct kind of ammunition. Remember, no more lead ammunition is permitted in the state, and you have to only hunt in deer season. And I guarantee you the deer will be eating your garden outside of deer season. So the answer is no, except for one specific type of permit that you can apply for if there are deer that are literally eating away your ability to make a living, if you are selling your produce, or deer that are taking away your ability to feed your family. You can apply for what is called a depredation permit, which will allow you to shoot a marauding animal out of season, but you still have to obey all the regulations, and there are a ton of them, and you cannot keep the deer. This is not a way to get venison to put in the freezer, because you have to dispose of the deer after you kill him, and you still have to obey all the laws. So and you have to prove to the Department of Fish and Wildlife that you have tried all the non-lethal methods that we're teaching you in this talk. So please give that a try first. Don't choose this as your first method of control. Deer-resistant plants. This is really the way to go unless you want to fence in your whole yard. I chose to fence in the back of my yard and plant the entire front yard with deer-resistant plants, which over the year I've had to do a little experimenting with. This applies to ornamental plantings, to landscape plantings, not veggies in the gardens, because as we've said before, they like the same veggies that we do. So that is not really an option. Deer, just like us, just like many animals, have foods they don't like, foods they like. So trying to plant the things they don't like is really one of your best bets as far as to keep your landscape intact. Combining that possibly with a few cages once in a while and some sprays. But if you put all of that together, you'll probably be okay. Except just remember in the winter or in the seasons when the natural browse is really gone and they are hungry, they will eat anything. Now, if you go to the nursery and you try to purchase a plant and you wonder to yourself, okay, how do I know if this plant is going to work? Is this plant deer resistant? Of course, you're going to be able to find lists of deer resistant plants. We will give you 2 of them in a few slides from now. And the people at the nurseries are usually very knowledgeable in this area because everyone has the same problem. But I'm going to tell you some of the things to look for to give you a good chance. Many plants resist deer because they're toxic, they're poison. And also many of these plants are poisonous to us as well. So oleander, foxglove, milkweed, poppies, all of these plants are ones that the deer will usually not eat, except of course fawns that will try anything even if it makes them sick. Deer will generally dislike plants with a strong smell, just like they dislike sprays with a strong smell, and that's the same reason. They need to be able to smell the sneaky mountain lion coming up behind them. So rosemary, lavender, sages, anise, peonies, those are all things that most of them that smell good to us, but the deer don't like it, anything that smells strongly. They also tend to avoid plants with sharp leaves, stickery leaves that will hurt their mouths, and even leaves that are like lamb's ears, that are highly textured, but not sharp, just nice, long, smooth, hairy leaves. They don't like those either. So I guess textured things is something they will try to avoid. But remember, they will often nibble new growth, even on a plant which is supposed to be deer resistant. So here we are in the map of sunset climate zones. And here we are right here, Nevada City, Grass Valley, Colfax, and the area up and down the Sierra foothills. We are zone 7 for the sunset climate zones. And that is often what you will see in the nursery when you go shopping. So zone 7 is something to keep in mind. And we have a really good list of deer resistant plants for the Sierra foothills in zone 7. Now the link to this list, which is 7 or 8 pages long and which you can print out, is on our Master Gardeners public website, ncmg.ucanr.org. And you can find the link there to this list and to the next one that I will give you. This one is written by one of our local experts, and it gives the Latin name, the Latin name, the common name, water requirements, sun and shade requirements, and it's divided into ground covers, trees, shrubs, vines, etc. So that depending on what you're looking for, it's a pretty good list and very usable. Now this list is landscape plants rated by deer resistance from Rutgers University. Yes, this is back east, but it has many of the same plants that we use out here. So it's a really good list to use. And one of the main pluses about this one is that it not only tells you what plants are deer resistant, but which ones they love. So, and everything in between. So these are the plants the deer will always eat. These are the plants the deer will hardly ever eat. And these are the plants in the middle. So when you go out to find whatever plant it is you're looking for, you can check here and find out how much trouble you're likely to have in the future. Perhaps you can plan accordingly. Now, I'm going to introduce you to, during these last few minutes, a picture of a gorgeous army of deer-resistant plants that grow here, either in my yard, in other Master Gardeners' yards, in yards in the area. You have more to choose from than you may realize, because Some people will just associate juniper, lavender, rosemary as being the only deer resistant plants that are available. And those three are obviously true, but that isn't all that you have to look forward to. But let's get started with those anyway. So juniper, stickery leaves, which the deer hate, and they come in ground cover and tall and hedge sized and in the middle, and they are a very handy plant for certain areas of the yard. If you are looking for deer resistance, that is it. We also have lavender, all kinds of lavenders, Spanish, French, English, lots of different kinds of lavender, which are very happy in this Mediterranean climate. And rosemary. Now this is mine. This is a culinary rosemary with pretty blue flowers in the spring, and you can prune it to be whatever size you want. But it isn't the only kind of rosemary. This particular one here belongs to a home of one of the other master gardeners, and she has used the prostrate rosemary and trained it to hang over a wall as a cascade, which is beautiful. Her whole yard is beautiful. In here, she has a pretty little smoke tree right there. So that's just another type of ways to grow rosemary. Manzanita, of course, everyone knows that that's native to the area, and it's very deer resistant and very resistant to pretty much everything. But if you have a manzanita that you take care of, you maybe water it a little as opposed to not at all, then it's a pretty plant, and it has these beautiful little pink bell-shaped flowers in the springtime. So it's really a good thing to have around. And this is one that's in my backyard. There is Lenten rose, which is a hellebore. It starts to bloom in February and blooms for months, and they are beautiful. Something to definitely consider, and the deer don't like them. Germander, which is a good bush for a hedge, or it comes in ground cover and smaller sizes. Something else, again, to use for a little variety. Ground covers like this phlox is a pretty color. St. John's wort or hypericum, which can spread, but definitely is deer resistant and will cover a larger area. And again, it hardly ever looks this good, but it looks pretty good, especially if you keep a little water on it. Yes, you can have bulbs, daffodils and iris. You cannot have tulips because the deer love them, but daffodils and iris are a really good choice, as you can tell, as they are all over town. Poppies, self-seeding, but very good for spreading in a yard to be pretty in the spring and cover a nice area, including the big poppies, the Mattia hot poppies, which the pollinators love and which are huge, gorgeous flowers. Peonies, which last forever, have gorgeous flowers and even pretty leaves, which will last the whole growing season. Hummingbird mint or hyssop is another pretty one, comes in many colors. Jerusalem sage, which is yellow or purple flowered. Red hot poker, which is a good one for fall or winter bloom for your pollinators and is pretty. Grassy type leaves. And this is spirea, very common in the foothills. You can find it at almost any nursery. The grasses, don't forget the grasses. That's the tall grasses, the carex or the sage grasses, which are the deer tend to ignore them. I never realized that, but they do. And lastly, in our list of plants, we have ferns that you can almost use as a ground cover. These are the native bracken ferns, very happy in the forest, but they will also take some sun. So it's a good use of plants in a local area that the deer won't eat. They tend to die back in the winter, but that's okay, they'll be back. So lastly, I'd like to give you some thoughts to take with you after you say goodbye today. Please don't feed the deer on purpose, because it won't work to keep them away from your plants. Protect any new plants that you plant until the deer are used to having them there. And study the lists before you plant so you know what you want. Reach for new plants, new combinations, new colors. Your yard can be just gorgeous and still deer resistant. And lastly, do fence in your veggie garden. I hope all of you have one. And thank you so much for joining us today. I will pass this back now to our moderator and our host.
Thank you, Bonnie. I love that. I also learned something new as a master gardener, so it's always good to revisit. You're really helpful. Thanks so much. I do have one question. Actually, I have several, but I don't want to take too long. Do you need an electric fence to keep the deer out?
No, you absolutely don't. Many people have chosen that way to go just because they are having trouble with a regular fence, or they are absolutely adamant about keeping the deer out. But no, that's an expensive way to go. And all you need to do is build the right kind of fence. I have had one for 20 years that's worked great. If you want to try to keep bear out, that's an entirely different matter, and it almost requires an electric fence, but we're not going to go into bear today.
That's a whole other matter. That's what I have at my house.
Oh yeah.
Thanks, Bonnie. The other thing about solar-powered ultrasonic deer repeller, do those work? The solar ones?
Well, the solar part of it works depending on what time of year it is, but the problem is that the deer become very accustomed very quickly to that sound that the solar-powered repellers emit, and so they might be shocked or startled by it and run away to begin with. But they won't stay away. They'll be back. And so I guess it might help if you move it around so that's in different locations. Anything to make it different, to make it coming from a different area, to use that along with a spray or along with other kinds of repellers, and move things around to keep the deer from getting used to them. It just makes things last a little bit longer.
Perfect. Thanks. I did have a question about a person who asked, and I knew that we could use Nevada County Fire District, but which plants are the most fire resistant that are still deer resistant? And I know that's probably a whole other workshop, but
it is.
Who else can we recommend?
That's a tough one, because technically we as master gardeners are not really supposed to get into the fire issues, because the fire safe council and the fire departments want to be the ones to recommend to our Nevada County gardeners that type of thing, how to maintain the plants around their dwellings. But the one thing that I can say is whatever plant that you plant, especially if it's near your house, be sure to keep it manicured, keep the dry, dead stuff out of the bottom of that plant. If you plant, say, manzanita, for example, I have ground cover manzanita out in the front. Dry, dead stuff can accumulate underneath that plant that you don't necessarily see. Well, get underneath there and keep it cleaned out, because that just makes for a fire danger no matter what. Other than that, I think I'd probably rather refer people to the local fire safe council for that answer.
Sounds great. Thank you, Bonnie. I know that's a long list, and it's good to be clued in on all that.
It is.
I do have a gal who asked about a spirea plant she has. It's 3 years old and she's yet to see it bloom because they eat every flower, of course. So any comment on that?
Well, okay. I know a lot of people will tell me repeatedly that their plants are being eaten and the next door neighbor's plants are not, and it's the same plant. So that lady may be unlucky enough to have her house and her plant be right on a commonly traveled deer trail. And so her neighbors may not, or mine, depending on where it is, mine may not. But if that spirea is continually being eaten because normally they aren't, then she can try give it spraying it with one of the local deer sprays before it blooms, and then when it blooms, keep it sprayed, keep those flowers sprayed to see if you can train the deer away from that plant. If not, then you may have to move it.
Very good. Okay, Bonnie, this one will be the ghost of Bonnie happening after we hang up. This one person heard that recording the sound of barking. Any input on that?
You know, that's actually a really good question. I've seen those for sale, and it's just like any other frightening device. It's liable to work for a while, but the deer are pretty sharp and they know the difference between a real dog and the recording of a dog, because the recording tends to be the same thing over and over again, and it doesn't move. It doesn't chase them. It doesn't come out in the yard and threaten them. And so they will probably get used to that recording, just like they would get used to lights flashing or garden hose coming on or a sprinkler, because they do have those things also with motion detectors on them. So I think probably the barking dog is not one of the better choices, but anything is worth a try. And if you use sort of a whole variety of things, then you may have better luck than just one thing.
Well, and thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Bonnie, because I did feel like you were just talking right to me. I do have a puppy that barks at the deer, and they just stand and look at her. So also appreciate you giving us the resources so we can go look up some plants and see how we want to go forward.